The first F-22 Raptor materialized from the clouds like a metallic wraith, its angular surfaces catching the dying light of the Pacific sunset. Major Kalin, Firehawk, Voss didn't flinch as the stealth fighter positioned itself 200 yards off her starboard wing, its pilot's helmet barely visible through the tinted canopy. The second Raptor emerged moments later, sliding into formation on her port side with predatory precision. Then came the third, fourth, fifth, until 8 F-22s formed a perfect octagon around her modified F-16C Fighting Falcon. The radio crackled to life. Unidentified aircraft, call sign Phoenix 77 Delta, you are in violation of restricted airspace. State your intentions immediately. Kalen's weathered hands remained steady on the controls despite the tremor that had started in her left shoulder 3 months ago. A souvenir from Kandahar that the VA doctors couldn't explain. Her aircraft bore no standard military markings, only a small phoenix painted in fatting gold on the nose cone, wings spread wide as if caught mid-resurrection. The F-16 itself looked like a museum piece compared to the cutting-edge technology surrounding her, its gray paint scarred by countless missions that officially never happened. Phoenix 77 Delta, respond immediately or you will be escorted to the nearest airfield for questioning. The lead F-22 pilot's voice carried the unmistakable arrogance of youth and advanced technology. Kalen had heard that tone before 20 years ago, when she was the hotshot newcomer dismissing the old-timers flying outdated equipment. Now she was the relic, her once pristine flight suit bearing the subtle stains of coffee, sweat, and determination that came with flying missions the Pentagon preferred to forget. She glanced at the sealed envelope in her cockpit, its contents more classified than the stealth fighters trying to intimidate her. The mission parameters were simple: deliver the package to coordinates that didn't exist on any official chart, using flight paths that had been scrubbed from every database. But simplicity and survival were rarely compatible in her line of work. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly below, its surface reflecting the orange and purple hues of twilight. Somewhere in that vast expanse was her destination, a place that existed in whispers and classified documents, where heroes were made and forgotten in equal measure. The F-22s could force her down, could blow her from the sky with weapons she'd never see coming. But they couldn't know what she carried, or why a forgotten pilot in an obsolete fighter had been chosen for this particular dance with destiny. Phoenix 77 Delta, this is your final warning. Kalen's thumb moved toward her radio transmitter. 26 years of service had taught her that sometimes the most important missions began with the simplest words. She keyed the mic, her voice calm despite the 8 deadly angels surrounding her. Raptor lead, this is Firehawk, permission to come aboard. The silence that followed stretched across the Pacific like a held breath. In the lead F-22's cockpit, Captain Marcus "Blade" Thompson felt his confidence waver. The call sign Firehawk meant nothing to him, just another relic pilot who'd probably gotten lost during a routine training flight. His squadron had intercepted dozens of aircraft that had wandered into restricted airspace, usually private pilots or foreign nationals testing American response times. But something about this one felt different. The F-16's flight pattern hadn't been erratic or panicked when they'd first detected it on radar. Instead, it had flown with the kind of surgical precision that came from flying in contested airspace, where a single mistake meant death. The pilot's voice carried none of the fear or bluster he'd come to expect from intercepted aircraft. Phoenix 77 Delta, you're not cleared for any approach. State your origin and destination immediately. His wingman, Lieutenant Sarah "Viper" Chen, pulled her F-22 closer to the unknown aircraft. Through her targeting system, she could see the pilot clearly now. A woman in her 40s, maybe 50s, with short gray hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of too many deployments in unforgiving places. The F-16 itself was a puzzle wrapped in contradictions. Old but meticulously maintained, bearing no standard military identification, but clearly operated by someone with serious flight training. "Blade, check her wingtip." Viper's voice crackled through the squadron frequency. "Port side navigation light." Thompson adjusted his position slightly, following his wingman's observation. The F-16's navigation light was flashing in a pattern he'd never seen before: 3 short pulses, followed by 2 long ones, then a pause before repeating. It wasn't standard aviation lighting, but something about the rhythm nagged at his memory from flight school. "Unknown pattern, Viper. Could be equipment malfunction." "Negative, Blade. That's deliberate. She's signaling something." In her cockpit, Kalen continued the wingtip pattern while maintaining perfect formation with the F-22s. The younger pilots surrounding her were good, better than good, actually. Their Raptors moved through the air with the fluid grace that came from thousands of hours in the most advanced fighter jets ever built. But they were missing something crucial, something that couldn't be taught in flight simulators or learned from technical manuals. They were missing the institutional memory that existed in the spaces between official protocols. The flash pattern she was transmitting had been retired from active use in 1998, replaced by digital communication systems that made the old light-based signals obsolete. But certain missions still required the old ways, missions that existed in the gray areas where modern technology was either too detectable or too vulnerable to electronic warfare. The setting sun painted the clouds in shades of amber and crimson, transforming the sky into a canvas of fire. Kalen had always loved this time of day, when the Earth's atmosphere acted like a prism, breaking white light into its component colors. It reminded her of her daughter Emma's watercolor paintings, the ones that still covered their refrigerator despite Emma being 23 and stationed at Fort Bragg. "Phoenix 77 Delta. You will alter course immediately to bearing 090 and follow us to Vandenberg Air Force Base for debriefing." Captain Thompson's patience was wearing thin. Protocol demanded that unidentified aircraft be escorted to the nearest military installation for questioning, regardless of how skilled their pilots might be. The woman flying the F-16 was clearly competent, but competence didn't grant immunity from regulations. "Blade, wait." Viper's voice carried a note of urgency. "I'm running the light pattern through the database. Give me 30 seconds." The F-22s maintained their formation while Viper's onboard computer processed the flashing sequence. Advanced avionics systems stored thousands of communication protocols, including many that had been classified or retired decades earlier. Most pilots never bothered learning the historical systems, trusting modern technology to handle all necessary communication. But some missions required older knowledge. Viper's breath caught as the computer returned a match. The light pattern corresponded to Emergency Protocol 7 Alpha, a classification so old that it predated most of their squadron's combined flight experience. The protocol had been designed for deep reconnaissance missions where radio silence was mandatory and aircraft identification systems had been intentionally disabled. According to the database, Emergency Protocol 7 Alpha had been restricted to a select group of pilots who specialized in missions that officially didn't exist. The kind of operations that were discussed only in secure facilities by officers whose names never appeared in public records. "Blade," Viper's voice was barely above a whisper. "She's running Emergency Protocol 7 Alpha. This isn't a lost pilot. She's operational." In the lead Raptor, Thompson felt his worldview shift slightly. Emergency Protocol 7 Alpha meant the F-16 pilot wasn't just authorized to be in restricted airspace. She was supposed to be here. The implication sent a chill down his spine despite the heated cockpit. "All units maintain formation but do not interfere with Phoenix 77 Delta's flight path," he commanded, his voice carrying newfound respect. "We are now providing escort, not interception." Kalen allowed herself a small smile as the F-22s adjusted their positions from hostile intercept to protective escort. The younger pilots were learning, adapting to information that challenged their initial assumptions. It was a good sign, the kind of tactical flexibility that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. The Pacific Ocean rolled beneath them like a living thing, its surface marked by whitecaps that caught the last rays of sunlight. Somewhere ahead lay her destination, a place that existed only in classified documents and the memories of those who had served there. The sealed envelope in her cockpit contained orders that would reshape the understanding of several ongoing operations, but only if she could deliver them to the right hands. Her F-16's engine hummed with the steady reliability that had made the Fighting Falcon a workhorse of air forces around the world. The aircraft was old by military standards, but age brought certain advantages. Modern stealth fighters like the F-22s surrounding her were marvels of technology, but they were also complex systems vulnerable to electronic warfare and requiring extensive maintenance support. Her F-16 could operate from damaged runways, carry a variety of weapons loads, and keep flying even after taking damage that would ground more sophisticated aircraft. Firehawk, this is Blade. What's your estimated time to destination? The question was phrased carefully, acknowledging that he didn't know her target while still gathering necessary tactical information. Thompson was learning to respect the protocols that governed operations beyond his clearance level. Blade, Firehawk, approximately 18 minutes to initial approach. Request you maintain current escort formation through final approach. Copy, Firehawk. Will stay with you until relieved. The radio exchange was professional, but Kalen could hear the curiosity in the younger pilot's voice. He wanted to know more about her mission, her aircraft, and the protocols that had suddenly elevated a routine intercept into something far more significant. That curiosity was natural. She had felt the same way during her early years, when every mission seemed to hint at larger operations happening just beyond her security clearance. Now she was part of those larger operations, carrying secrets that could shift the balance of power in theaters of operation most people would never hear about. The weight of that responsibility had grown heavier over the years, but it had also given her purpose beyond simple military service. Her daughter Emma had asked her once why she continued flying dangerous missions when she could easily transition to a desk job or civilian aviation. The answer wasn't something she could explain to a daughter who deserved normal conversations about normal things. But the truth was simple. Some missions required pilots who understood that victory sometimes came at the cost of recognition, and that the most important operations were often the ones that never made the news. The formation of F-22s adjusted slightly as they encountered a patch of turbulence, their computer-controlled flight systems compensating automatically for the atmospheric disturbance. Kalen made the same adjustments manually, her hands feeling the aircraft's response through the control stick. The difference between computer-assisted flight and pure pilot skill was subtle but significant. Machines could react faster than humans, but they couldn't anticipate or adapt to situations that fell outside their programming parameters. As they flew deeper into the Pacific, the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in deep purples and midnight blues. Stars began appearing in the darkness above, their light unfiltered by the thin atmosphere at 35,000 feet. Navigation lights from the F-22s created a constellation of red and green points surrounding her aircraft, a modern interpretation of the formation flying that had protected bombers over Europe 8 decades earlier. The radio crackled with brief, professional exchanges between the Raptor pilots as they coordinated their escort duties. Their voices carried the confidence that came from flying the most advanced fighter jets in the world, but Kalen could also detect traces of uncertainty as they grappled with protocols they'd never encountered before. Military aviation was built on precision and predictability. Every procedure documented, every scenario planned for, every contingency covered by regulations thick enough to stop bullets. But real operations often required improvisation, adaptation, and decisions that couldn't be found in any manual. The F-22 pilots were discovering that their technological superiority meant nothing if they couldn't adapt to situations that transcended their training. Her radio sparked to life with a transmission that made everyone in the formation tense. All aircraft, this is Overwatch. You are approaching classified airspace. Raptor Squadron, you are cleared to return to base immediately. The voice belonged to an air traffic controller with clearances that exceeded those of the pilots he was directing. Overwatch was the call sign used by personnel who coordinated missions that existed in the shadow spaces between official military operations. Hearing that call sign meant they were entering an area where normal rules didn't apply. Overwatch, this is Blade. Request permission to continue escort until Firehawk reaches her destination. Negative, Blade. Your mission parameters do not include access to the operational area ahead. RTB immediately. Captain Thompson felt frustration building in his chest. After 20 minutes of escort duty, he was being ordered to abandon the most interesting mission he'd encountered in 3 years of flying F-22s. The mysterious pilot had earned his respect through her professionalism and the protocols that clearly placed her in a different category of operations entirely. Overwatch, Blade. Firehawk has been flying solo in potentially hostile airspace. Request permission to provide continued air cover. Blade, you are not cleared for the airspace ahead. Firehawk is authorized to continue alone. RTB now, or face disciplinary action for failure to follow direct orders. The radio silence that followed carried the weight of military discipline clashing with pilot instincts. Thompson had been trained to protect other aircraft, to never abandon a wingman, to ensure that no pilot flew alone into danger. But he had also been trained to follow orders from superiors whose authority superseded his personal preferences. In her F-16, Kaylin listened to the exchange with a mixture of appreciation and sadness. The F-22 pilots had performed their escort duties professionally, adapting to circumstances beyond their initial understanding. But some missions required absolute secrecy, and secrecy sometimes meant leaving good pilots with unanswered questions. Blade, Firehawk, thank you for the escort. You've done good work today. Her words carried the weight of recognition from someone whose opinion clearly mattered in circles beyond the younger pilot's experience. Thompson felt a surge of pride despite his frustration at being dismissed from the mission. Firehawk, it's been an honor. Fly safe out there. The 8 F-22 Raptors peeled away from formation with the fluid grace of their namesake birds, their navigation lights creating brief streaks of color against the darkening sky before disappearing into the distance. Within minutes, Kaylin was alone again, her F-16 cutting through the night air toward coordinates that existed only in classified databases. The Pacific Ocean below had become an endless sheet of black glass, reflecting starlight in patterns that shifted with every wave. Navigation was now purely instrumental, relying on GPS coordinates that had been encrypted multiple times before being loaded into her flight computer. The destination was still 12 minutes away, but she could already sense the change in the mission's character as she approached the operational area. Her radio had been silent since the F-22s departed, but she knew that didn't mean she was unobserved. Satellites tracked her progress, radar installations monitored her approach, and somewhere in a secure facility, personnel whose names she would never know were coordinating the final phase of her delivery mission. The sealed envelope in her cockpit represented months of intelligence gathering, analysis, and risk assessment. Its contents would influence decisions made by officers whose responsibilities spanned multiple theaters of operation. But for now, her job was simple: deliver the package to the right people at the right place, exactly as she had done dozens of times before. She thought about Emma's latest letter, filled with stories about training exercises at Fort Bragg, and complaints about the North Carolina humidity. Her daughter was a communications specialist, skilled at maintaining contact between units operating in challenging environments. In some ways, they were both in the business of making sure important information reached the people who needed it most. The difference was that Emma's communications were logged, recorded, and archived according to military regulations. Kalen's missions existed in the spaces between official records, carrying information too sensitive for normal channels or too urgent for standard bureaucratic processes. Her fuel gauge showed adequate reserves for the mission plus emergency contingencies, but night flights over open ocean always carried additional risks. Weather could change rapidly, navigation systems could malfunction, and mechanical problems that would be minor inconveniences over land became life-threatening emergencies over thousands of miles of empty water. But these were familiar risks, acceptable trade-offs for the kind of work that defined her professional identity. She had been flying dangerous missions for 26 years, accumulating experience that couldn't be replicated in simulators or learned from textbooks. Every scar on her F-16's airframe told a story of survival, adaptation, and mission accomplishment under conditions that would have grounded less experienced pilots. The night air was smooth at 35,000 feet, free from the turbulence that plagued lower altitudes. Stars provided a natural navigation reference, their positions unchanged since the first pilots had looked up at the night sky and dreamed of flight. Modern technology had made navigation more precise, but the fundamental relationship between pilot and sky remained constant across generations of aviators. Her destination was now 8 minutes away, close enough that she could begin preparing for the approach phase of her mission. The coordinates led to a facility that didn't appear on civilian maps, surrounded by airspace that was officially empty but actually monitored by some of the most sophisticated detection systems ever deployed. She was about to enter a world where every landing was potentially her last, and every takeoff represented another chance to serve purposes larger than personal recognition or career advancement. The first indication that she was approaching her destination came not from her instruments, but from the sudden appearance of lights on the ocean surface far below. They formed a perfect rectangle, outlining what appeared to be a floating runway that hadn't existed on any chart during her mission briefing. The lights were dim, barely visible against the dark water, but their geometric precision marked them as definitely artificial. Her radio crackled to life with a transmission that used call signs she hadn't heard in over a decade. Phoenix 77 Delta, this is Deep Blue Control. You are cleared for approach to runway 27. Winds are calm, visibility unlimited. Welcome to the Prometheus. The name sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the night air outside her cockpit. Prometheus was a classified program that had been terminated in 2019, its personnel reassigned, its equipment disposed of through channels that left no paper trail. Or so the official records claimed. But here was Deep Blue Control using Prometheus protocols, directing her toward a floating facility that existed in violation of multiple international treaties. The sealed envelope in her cockpit suddenly felt heavier, its contents apparently significant enough to justify reactivating operations that were supposed to have been permanently discontinued. Deep Blue Control, Phoenix 77 Delta, confirm Prometheus is operational. Affirmative, Phoenix 77 Delta. Full operational status as of 0600 hours local time. You are cleared to land. As she descended toward the lights, more details of the floating facility became visible. The Prometheus was a modified aircraft carrier, but one designed specifically for operations that couldn't be conducted from land-based installations. Its deck was wider than standard carriers, capable of handling aircraft that required extended runway lengths. Defensive weapon systems were visible along its superstructure, suggesting that it was prepared for more than simple logistics support. The approach required precision flying that tested every aspect of her pilot training. Carrier landings were challenging under the best circumstances, but night approaches to facilities that officially didn't exist added layers of complexity that pushed human skill to its limits. Her F-16 touched down on the carrier deck with the controlled violence that defined all successful carrier landings, arresting cables bringing her aircraft to a stop within predetermined distances. Ground crew personnel materialized from the shadows, their movements coordinated by hand signals that hadn't been used by mainstream military units in over a decade. They were dressed in black coveralls with no visible insignia, their faces hidden by the kind of night vision equipment that didn't appear in standard military budgets. As her engine spun down, Kaylin remained in her cockpit, following protocols that required positive identification before dismounting from her aircraft. The sealed envelope felt impossibly heavy in her hands, its contents representing information that had justified reactivating a program most people believed had been permanently terminated. A figure approached her aircraft, and she recognized the distinctive gait of someone who had spent decades walking on ship decks in heavy seas. When he came close enough for her to see his face clearly, she felt recognition hit her like a physical blow. Commander Richard Prophet Morrison had been declared dead in a helicopter crash off the coast of Syria 18 months earlier. His memorial service had been attended by over 300 military personnel, including several flag officers who had praised his dedication to operations that couldn't be discussed in public forums. But here he was, alive and apparently in command of a facility that wasn't supposed to exist. "Hello, Firehawk," he called up to her cockpit. "Welcome back to the war that never ended." His words carried implications that extended far beyond her current mission. The Prometheus represented more than just a reactivated program. It was evidence that certain conflicts continued to rage in the shadows, fought by personnel whose deaths had been staged to provide them with the ultimate operational cover. She climbed down from her F-16 with the careful movements of someone who had spent too many years in cramped cockpits, her body protesting the transition from flight to ground operations. The carrier deck felt solid beneath her feet, but she could sense the subtle movement that marked all ocean-based operations. The Prometheus was a stable platform, but it was still subject to the forces that governed everything that floated on the world's oceans. "Prophet, I was told you were dead." "I got better," he replied with the dry humor that had made him legendary among pilots who specialized in missions that didn't appear in official records. "Walk with me. We have a lot to discuss, and very little time to discuss it." The sealed envelope felt warm in her hands as she followed Morrison across the carrier deck. Around them, the Prometheus hummed with the activity of a fully operational military facility, but the personnel moved with the careful precision of people who understood that their very existence was classified at levels that transcended normal security protocols. Her mission was far from over. In fact, based on Morrison's presence and the reactivation of the Prometheus, it was just beginning. They walked in silence toward the carrier's superstructure, their footsteps echoing against the metal deck. The night air carried the salt smell of the ocean mixed with the mechanical odors of aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid. It was a combination that had defined her professional life for over 2 decades, but tonight it seemed heavier with implications she was only beginning to understand. Morrison led her through a maze of corridors that had been modified extensively from standard carrier architecture. The walls were lined with displays showing real-time intelligence from theaters of operation around the world, their screens updating constantly, with information that represented the work of intelligence assets, whose identities were protected by layers of classification that few people were authorized to penetrate. "The envelope," Morrison said without turning around, "contains the final piece of intelligence we need to initiate Operation Lazarus. What you've delivered tonight will determine whether we can prevent a conflict that would reshape the balance of power in 3 different regions simultaneously." They entered a briefing room that looked like something from a science fiction film, its walls covered with displays that showed satellite imagery, intercept transcripts, and tactical analyses that represented millions of dollars in intelligence gathering. Personnel in civilian clothing worked at computer stations that were clearly more advanced than anything she had seen in standard military installations. "Firehawk, meet the team that's been working on this operation for the past 8 months," Morrison announced. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the pilot who just delivered the intelligence that makes Lazarus possible." The room filled with applause that felt genuine rather than perfunctory. These people understood the risk she had taken to deliver information that would influence operations most of them would never be authorized to know about in detail. Her flight through restricted airspace, the encounter with the F-22s, the night carrier landing, all of it had been necessary to ensure that critical intelligence reached the people who could act on it. She handed the sealed envelope to Morrison, feeling a mixture of relief and anticipation as the weight of responsibility transferred from her hands to his. But instead of opening it immediately, he set it aside and turned to face her directly. "Before we proceed with the briefing, I need to ask you a question that will determine your level of involvement in what happens next. Are you prepared to accept a mission assignment that will require you to remain dead to the outside world for an indefinite period?" The question hit her like a physical blow. Remaining dead meant abandoning her official identity, severing all contact with family and friends, accepting that Emma would believe her mother had died in the service of her country. It meant becoming a ghost, existing only in the classified world of operations that couldn't be acknowledged by conventional military structures. But it also meant being part of operations that could prevent conflicts before they started, protecting lives, by ensuring that wars were fought in boardrooms and intelligence centers, rather than on battlefields where young soldiers paid the price for strategic miscalculations. "What about my daughter?" she asked, the words coming out more softly than she had intended. "Emma will be told that you died in a training accident. She'll receive full military honors, survivor benefits, and the support of a community that understands the sacrifice of military families. Your official record will show 26 years of honorable service concluded by a tragic but heroic end." Morrison's voice carried the weight of someone who had made similar sacrifices himself. His own family believed he was dead, buried in Arlington National Cemetery under a headstone that bore his name and dates of service. The choice between personal relationships and larger purposes was one that defined the lives of people who operated in the shadow spaces between official military structures. "And if I choose not to accept?" "Then you'll be debriefed, sworn to secrecy about everything you've seen tonight, and returned to your previous assignment. The Prometheus will disappear again, and you'll spend the rest of your career wondering what might have been different if you had chosen to stay." She looked around the briefing room, taking in the faces of people who had made the choice Morrison was offering her. They were all professionals, clearly competent and dedicated to purposes that transcended personal recognition. But they were also people who had chosen to exist outside the normal structure of human relationships, sacrificing connections to family and friends for the opportunity to influence events that most people would never know had been prevented. The decision would define the rest of her life. Choose personal relationships and conventional retirement, or choose continued service in operations that could prevent conflicts but would require her to abandon everyone who mattered to her on a personal level. She thought about Emma's letters, filled with stories about training exercises and complaints about base housing. Her daughter was building a military career of her own, following a path that would bring recognition and advancement through normal channels. Emma didn't need a mother who existed only in the classified world of operations that couldn't be acknowledged. But she also thought about the conflicts she had seen during her career, the wars that had started because critical intelligence hadn't reached the right people in time to prevent tragedy. The missions she had flown had saved lives by ensuring that decision-makers had access to information that changed the calculations that led to war or peace. "How long do I have to decide?" 12 hours, Morrison replied. "Operation Lazarus begins at dawn, with or without your participation. But the intelligence you delivered makes success significantly more likely if you're part of the team that executes the mission." She nodded, understanding that 12 hours wasn't really enough time to make a decision that would reshape her entire existence. But it was the same kind of compressed timeline that had defined her entire military career, where critical choices had to be made with incomplete information under pressure that left no room for extended deliberation. "Can I see the operational plan?" Morrison smiled, recognizing the tone of someone who was already committed to a course of action despite the personal costs involved. He activated a wall display that showed a tactical situation spanning 3 continents, with indicators that represented assets and threats in a dozen different theaters of operation. Operation Lazarus is designed to prevent a coordinated terrorist attack that would trigger military responses from 4 different nations simultaneously. The intelligence you delivered tonight confirmed the location of the coordination center and the identity of the key personnel involved. We have a 36-hour window to neutralize the threat before it becomes unstoppable. The display showed real-time intelligence that represented the work of assets operating at incredible personal risk in some of the most dangerous locations on the planet. Seeing their reports coordinated into a comprehensive tactical picture drove home the stakes involved in the decision she was being asked to make. "My role would be primary pilot for the insertion team that will neutralize the coordination center. It's a night flight over hostile territory to a landing zone that may be compromised, followed by extraction under fire if things go badly. Exactly the kind of mission you've been preparing for your entire career." She looked at the tactical display, recognizing the geographic features that would define the mission's success or failure. The landing zone was in mountainous terrain, surrounded by anti-aircraft systems that could track and engage any aircraft that entered their range. The insertion would require flying below radar coverage through valleys that offered no room for error, followed by a precision landing in an area barely large enough to accommodate her F-16. It was a mission that pushed pilot skill to absolute limits while requiring the kind of tactical judgment that came only from years of experience in similar operations. Success would prevent a conflict that could claim thousands of lives. Failure would probably result in her death and the continuation of planning for attacks that would reshape international relations for decades. "I'll do it," she said, the words coming out with the certainty that had defined her approach to every critical decision in her military career. Morrison nodded, showing none of the surprise that might have been expected from someone receiving a positive answer to a request that required abandoning a normal life. In the world of classified operations, personal sacrifice was assumed rather than celebrated, a necessary cost of preventing conflicts that most people would never know had been considered. "Welcome to Lazarus, Firehawk. Your new life begins now." The briefing that followed lasted until dawn, covering operational details that represented months of intelligence gathering and tactical planning. The target was a facility hidden in mountains that straddled the border between 2 nations whose governments had been carefully kept unaware of the terrorist coordination center operating in their territory. The facility was protected by surface-to-air missiles that had been acquired through channels that bypassed every international arms control treaty signed in the past 2 decades. Her approach would follow valleys that provided natural radar masking, but also limited her options if she encountered unexpected resistance. The extraction plan assumed that the insertion team would complete their mission within 4 hours, but also included contingencies for extended operations if the tactical situation developed differently than anticipated. Personnel files for her team members revealed professionals whose backgrounds spanned multiple military specialties and civilian skills that complemented their official training. They were people who had chosen to exist in the same shadow world she was entering, sacrificing normal lives for the opportunity to prevent conflicts through direct action rather than diplomatic negotiation. As the sun rose over the Pacific, painting the carrier deck in shades of gold and orange, Kaylin felt the weight of her decision settling into her bones. Emma would receive news of her death within hours, beginning a grieving process that would reshape her daughter's understanding of military service and personal sacrifice. Friends and colleagues would attend a memorial service that honored her official career, while maintaining absolute silence about the operations that had defined her actual contributions to national security. But somewhere in the mountains of a country whose name would never appear in newspaper accounts of prevented attacks, she would be flying a mission that could save thousands of lives by ensuring that coordination centers never had the opportunity to execute plans that had taken years to develop. Morrison handed her a new flight suit that bore no insignia, no name tags, no indication of national affiliation. It was the uniform of pilots who existed outside the normal structure of military hierarchies, accountable only to the missions they accepted and the outcomes they achieved through skill and determination. Your F-16 has been modified with avionics that don't appear in any technical manual, he explained. Navigation systems that can penetrate electronic warfare environments, communication equipment that can maintain contact through jamming that would disable normal military radios, and defensive systems that might give you an edge if you encounter unexpected resistance. She suited up with the methodical precision that had carried her through thousands of hours of flight operations, but this time the familiar routine carried the weight of finality. When she walked out to her aircraft, she would be beginning a mission that would either save thousands of lives or cost her own life in the attempt. Her F-16 had indeed been modified extensively, its cockpit filled with displays and controls that represented technology decades ahead of standard military equipment. The aircraft looked the same from the outside, but its capabilities had been enhanced to levels that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with current aviation technology. As she completed her pre-flight checks, ground crew personnel worked around her aircraft with the efficiency of people who understood that mission success depended on perfect execution of every technical detail. These were not normal military personnel, but specialists whose skills had been developed through training that went far beyond what was available through conventional career paths. The mission clock showed 6 hours until insertion time, but those hours would pass quickly as she flew toward mountains that contained threats designed to eliminate any aircraft that attempted to penetrate their defensive perimeter. The Terrorist Coordination Center was protected by people who understood that discovery would mean death or imprisonment, giving them incentives to resist that went far beyond normal military motivation. Her radio crackled with transmission from Morrison, who was coordinating the operation from a command center deep within the Prometheus. Firehawk, final weather update shows clear skies at the target, but ground fog in the valleys that could complicate your approach. Are you prepared to proceed? Affirmative, deep blue, all systems green, ready for launch on your command. The catapult system that would launch her F-16 from the carrier deck represented the marriage of advanced technology with physics that hadn't changed, since the first aircraft had been launched from ships during World War I. Success depended on precise coordination between human operators and mechanical systems that had to function perfectly despite the stresses imposed by ocean operations. Firehawk, you are cleared for launch. Execute Lazarus. Bring our people home. The catapult engaged with the violent acceleration that marked all carrier launches, throwing her F-16 forward with forces that pressed her back into her ejection seat, despite the restraint systems designed to protect pilots during such operations. Within seconds, she was airborne and climbing toward the altitude that would begin her approach to the most dangerous mission of her career. Below her, the Prometheus shrank to a tiny speck of light on the dark ocean, a reminder that her only connection to safety lay hundreds of miles behind her, as she flew toward mountains that contained people who would kill her without hesitation if they detected her approach. The mission had begun. Emma would soon believe her mother was dead. Friends would attend a memorial service that honored a career that had officially ended, and somewhere in the mountains ahead, a coordination center continued planning attacks that could trigger conflicts spanning multiple continents. But for now, she was simply a pilot flying a night mission over hostile territory, depending on skill and determination to complete objectives that would never be acknowledged by the people whose lives would be saved by her success. The flight toward the target area took her over terrain that shifted from ocean to desert to mountains, with the kind of geographic diversity that defines some of the world's most contested regions. Each mile covered brought her closer to airspace, where her aircraft's electronic signature would be analyzed by defensive systems designed to eliminate intruders before they could threaten the coordination center hidden in the mountains ahead. Her modified avionics systems provided real-time intelligence updates that painted a constantly changing picture of threats and opportunities along her planned route. Surface-to-air missile sites appeared and disappeared from her displays, as intelligence assets updated their assessments of defensive capabilities that could engage her aircraft if she deviated from the narrow corridors that provided safe passage through hostile territory. The mountains rose ahead of her like sleeping giants, their peaks covered with snow that reflected starlight in patterns that had guided pilots for generations before GPS systems made celestial navigation obsolete. But tonight, the mountains also concealed radar installations that could track her approach and guide weapons that would destroy her F-16 before she could complete her mission. Her radio maintained contact with Morrison aboard the Prometheus, but their communications were limited to brief, coded transmissions that wouldn't reveal her position to anyone monitoring radio frequencies in the operational area. The isolation was complete. She was flying alone into territory where discovery meant death, depending entirely on her own skill and the modifications that had transformed her F-16 into an aircraft capable of penetrating defenses that would defeat normal military systems. The first valley that would provide radar masking appeared ahead of her, its walls rising like cathedral spires on either side of her flight path. Flying through mountain valleys at night required absolute precision, with margins for error measured in feet rather than miles. The modified terrain-following radar in her aircraft provided guidance that allowed her to maintain safe clearance from the valley walls while staying below the radar coverage that would detect her presence. As she descended into the valley, the world outside her cockpit became a tunnel of darkness broken only by occasional reflections of starlight from snow-covered peaks. The sensation was like flying through the inside of a cathedral, with walls that rose beyond the reach of her aircraft's lights, and a ceiling formed by stars that seemed impossibly distant from the claustrophobic confines of the mountain passage. Her target coordinates were still 40 minutes away, but intelligence updates indicated that the Terrorist Coordination Center was maintaining normal operational schedules, unaware that their location had been discovered and their plans compromised. The element of surprise was critical to mission success. If the Coordination Center detected the approaching insertion team, they could disperse to backup locations that would take months to identify and target. The valley floor rose steadily as she approached the mountain passes that would provide access to the operational area. Her F-16's engines ran whisper quiet, their sound signature reduced by modifications that came from research programs that didn't appear in any public budget documents. Every aspect of her approach had been designed to avoid detection until the moment when concealment was no longer possible. Her radio crackled with a transmission that made her blood run cold. Unknown aircraft in Sector 7, you are in violation of restricted airspace. Identify yourself immediately or you will be engaged. The transmission came from ground-based air defense personnel, who were clearly using detection systems more advanced than intelligence estimates had indicated. Her stealth modifications had been defeated by radar technology that shouldn't have existed in the operational area, forcing her to abandon the careful approach that had been planned for months. All stations, this is Firehawk. I am being painted by target acquisition radar. Request immediate support. Morrison's response came through encrypted channels that scrambled his voice into electronic patterns that were barely recognizable as human speech. Firehawk, no support assets are available in your operational area. Execute evasive maneuvers and continue to target. She was alone, facing defensive systems that had detected her presence and were probably already calculating firing solutions for weapons that could engage her aircraft at ranges that exceeded her ability to fight back. The mission could still succeed if she could reach the landing zone before surface-to-air missiles eliminated her F-16. But success now required flying through defensive fires that had been positioned specifically to prevent exactly the kind of insertion she was attempting. Her hands moved across her aircraft's controls with the unconscious precision that came from thousands of hours of training for situations that tested pilot skill beyond normal limits. Chaff and flares deployed automatically as her electronic warfare systems detected missile launches from positions that hadn't appeared on any intelligence estimate. The night sky filled with streaks of light as surface-to-air missiles converged on her position from multiple directions simultaneously. The first missile passed close enough to her aircraft that she could see its guidance fins, adjusting to track her flight path. Her F-16 responded to her control inputs with the agility that had made the Fighting Falcon famous, pulling G-forces that pressed her deep into her ejection seat as she maneuvered to avoid weapons that were designed to kill aircraft much more advanced than her modified fighter. Banking hard left, she dove toward the valley floor, using the mountain walls to mask her heat signature from infrared-guided missiles that were tracking her engine exhaust. The terrain-following radar painted a constantly changing picture of obstacles that rose from the valley floor like fingers reaching toward her aircraft, each one representing a potential collision that would end her mission and her life simultaneously. Her electronic warfare systems were working overtime, jamming target acquisition radars while deploying countermeasures that created false targets for missiles that were still tracking her aircraft. The night air was filled with electronic noise as her systems battled defensive networks that had been designed by people who understood exactly how modern aircraft tried to penetrate protected airspace. Firehawk, you are approaching Point Alpha. Landing zone is 2 minutes ahead. Morrison's transmission carried the calm professionalism that had defined his career, but she could hear the tension underneath his words. The landing zone was in a clearing barely large enough to accommodate her F-16, surrounded by trees that would destroy her aircraft if she miscalculated her approach by even a few feet. Another missile launch warning filled her cockpit with alarms that competed with the terrain-following radar for her attention. This missile was different, faster, more maneuverable, equipped with guidance systems that weren't confused by the countermeasures that had defeated the earlier weapons. Her F-16 shuddered as she pulled the aircraft through a turn that pushed the airframe to its structural limits, feeling the wings flex under G-forces that approached the maximum the aircraft was designed to handle. The missile passed close enough to trigger proximity sensors, its warhead exploding in a ball of fire that lit up the valley like artificial daylight. Shrapnel peppered her aircraft's fuselage, causing warning lights to illuminate across her instrument panel, as systems that had been functioning normally suddenly reported damage that could affect her ability to complete the mission. But her F-16 was still flying, still responding to her control inputs, still carrying her toward the landing zone where the insertion team was waiting for transport to the coordination center that remained unaware of the forces converging on their position. The clearing appeared ahead of her, a patch of darkness surrounded by trees that looked impossibly small from her cockpit. Landing in such a confined space required precision that left no room for error. Too fast, and she would overshoot into the trees. Too slow, and she would stall and crash short of the runway that existed only as a cleared strip of ground marked by lights that had been positioned by personnel who were already in position around the coordination center. Her F-16 touched down hard, bouncing once before settling onto the makeshift runway with the controlled violence that characterized all landings in contested territory. Trees flashed past her wingtips as she applied maximum braking, bringing her aircraft to a stop within yards of the tree line that marked the end of the available landing distance. Engine shutdown was accomplished in seconds rather than the normal minutes required for safe procedures. The insertion team materialized from the shadows, their faces painted with camouflage that made them nearly invisible in the darkness. They moved with the fluid coordination that came from training together until individual actions became part of a larger tactical organism that functioned according to principles that had been perfected through decades of special operations experience. Firehawk package is secure. Estimated time to target neutralization is 90 minutes. The team leader's voice carried the calm confidence that defined special operations personnel who had trained for missions that pushed human capabilities to their absolute limits. These were people who specialized in operations that couldn't be acknowledged by conventional military structures, working in the shadow spaces where success was measured by conflicts that were prevented rather than battles that were won. As the insertion team disappeared into the forest, Kaylin remained with her aircraft, monitoring communications that would provide updates on their progress toward the coordination center. Her role now was to maintain the F-16 in condition for immediate departure when the team completed their mission, ready to extract personnel who might be under fire from defenders who were finally beginning to understand that their location had been compromised. The forest around the landing zone was quiet except for the normal sounds of nocturnal wildlife, but her sensors detected movement patterns that suggested human activity in areas where no civilian presence should have existed. The coordination center's security forces were expanding their search perimeter, probably in response to the air defense engagements that had marked her approach to the landing zone. Her radio crackled with transmission from the insertion team as they approached the coordination center. Firehawk, we have visual contact with the target. Security is heavier than intelligence estimates indicated. Recommend you prepare for immediate extraction on completion of primary mission. The transmission meant that the team was encountering resistance that could complicate their escape after neutralizing the coordination center. Her F-16 would need to be ready for takeoff within minutes of their return, possibly under fire from security forces who would be trying to prevent their escape. She completed abbreviated pre-flight checks that focused on systems critical to getting her aircraft airborne quickly, accepting calculated risks that would be unacceptable under normal circumstances, but were necessary given the tactical situation. The warning lights that had illuminated during her approach indicated damage to non-essential systems, but her engines were functioning normally, and her flight controls responded properly to her inputs. Explosions in the distance marked the beginning of the assault on the coordination center, their sound echoing through the mountain valleys like thunder that lasted longer than any natural phenomenon. The insertion team was encountering significant resistance, but the explosions also indicated that they were successfully penetrating the facility's defenses and disrupting operations that had been planned for months. Her radio erupted with transmissions as the tactical situation developed rapidly around the coordination center. Firehawk, primary target is neutralized, but we are taking fire from secondary positions. Request immediate extraction. The team was under fire and moving toward her position, but they were also being pursued by security forces who understood that preventing their escape was critical to maintaining the secrecy that protected other coordination centers in different locations. The forest around her landing zone was about to become a battlefield where success would be measured by her ability to get her aircraft airborne before defensive fires eliminated her F-16 and the personnel it was supposed to extract. Muzzle flashes began appearing in the tree line as the insertion team fought a running battle toward her position. Their tactical discipline was evident in their coordinated movements, but they were outnumbered by security forces who were fighting for their lives as well as their operational security. The extraction would require precision timing that left no room for error. Too early, and the team wouldn't reach her aircraft. Too late and defensive fires would prevent takeoff. Firehawk, we are 30 seconds from your position. Request immediate engine start. Her F-16's engines wound up with the distinctive whine that had announced the presence of fighting Falcons on battlefields around the world for over 4 decades. The aircraft was ready for immediate departure, but takeoff from the confined landing zone would require precise coordination with the insertion team's arrival to minimize the time her aircraft spent vulnerable on the ground. The first team member emerged from the forest, moving with the controlled urgency that characterized personnel extracting from a hostile environment under fire. Behind him, muzzle flashes marked the positions of his teammates as they provided covering fire for their withdrawal to the aircraft. The tactical discipline that had made the mission possible was now focused entirely on survival and escape. Go, go, go! The team leader's voice carried the authority of someone whose decisions would determine whether his personnel lived or died in the next few minutes. They piled into her aircraft with practiced efficiency, strapping themselves into positions that had been modified specifically to accommodate insertion team personnel during high-risk extractions. Her F-16 began its takeoff roll before the last team member had fully secured himself, accelerating down the makeshift runway as defensive fires converged on their position from multiple directions. Trees flashed past her wingtips as the aircraft lifted off, climbing rapidly to clear the mountain peaks that surrounded the landing zone like the walls of a fortress, designed to trap intruders who penetrated its defenses. Surface-to-air missiles launched from positions that had remained hidden during her approach, their guidance systems tracking her aircraft as it climbed away from the coordination center that was now burning in the valley below. The insertion team had succeeded in neutralizing the immediate threat, but their escape was far from certain as defensive systems that had been designed specifically to prevent such extractions focused all their capabilities on destroying her F-16. Her electronic warfare systems deployed countermeasures that filled the night sky with false targets while she maneuvered through mountain passes that provided cover from radar-guided weapons. The terrain that had concealed her approach now protected her escape, but only if she could maintain the precise flying that kept her aircraft below the radar coverage that would guide missiles to her position. Firehawk, this is Deep Blue. You are cleared to return home. Outstanding work. Morrison's transmission carried the satisfaction of someone whose operational planning had achieved its objectives despite resistance that had exceeded intelligence estimates. The coordination center was destroyed, its personnel eliminated or scattered, and the attacks that had been planned from that location would never be executed. Thousands of lives had been saved by a mission that most people would never know had been necessary. But for Kaylin, the mission's success was measured by the fact that her aircraft was still flying, and the insertion team was safely aboard. Professional satisfaction would come later, after landing and debriefing had confirmed that all objectives had been accomplished without casualties among personnel whose identities would never appear in any official records. Her F-16 climbed away from the mountains, carrying people who existed in the shadow spaces between official military structures. They were professionals who had chosen to sacrifice normal lives for the opportunity to prevent conflicts through direct action, and tonight they had succeeded in disrupting plans that could have triggered regional warfare spanning multiple continents. The flight back to the Prometheus took place over ocean that reflected starlight like scattered diamonds, peaceful and eternal in contrast to the violence they had just escaped. Her aircraft's warning lights had stabilized, indicating that the shrapnel damage sustained during her approach hadn't affected systems critical to flight safety. The F-16 would require maintenance, but it had performed exactly as designed during operations that pushed both pilot and aircraft to their limits. As they approached the carrier, Kalen felt the familiar mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration that followed successful missions. The insertion team was quiet, processing events that had tested their training and determination in ways that couldn't be replicated during peacetime exercises. They had faced people who were trying to kill them, and they had prevailed through skill, teamwork, and the kind of tactical discipline that defined special operations personnel. The Prometheus appeared on the horizon as a cluster of lights that marked safety and the beginning of debriefing procedures that would analyze every aspect of the mission for lessons that could improve future operations. Landing on the carrier required the same precision that had characterized every aspect of the mission. But now, she was approaching friendly territory where ground crew personnel were prepared to receive her aircraft and begin the maintenance that would prepare it for the next operation. Her F-16 touched down on the carrier deck, with the controlled impact that marked all successful carrier landings, arresting cables bringing her aircraft to a stop within predetermined distances. Ground crew personnel materialized from their positions, moving with practiced efficiency to secure her aircraft and begin post-flight inspections that would determine the extent of battle damage sustained during the mission. As her engine spun down, Kaylin felt the weight of the decision she had made settling into her consciousness. Emma would soon receive notification that her mother had died in a training accident, beginning a grieving process that would reshape her daughter's understanding of military service and personal sacrifice. Friends and colleagues would attend a memorial service that honored her official career, while maintaining absolute silence about the operations that had defined her actual contributions to national security. But somewhere in the mountains of a country whose name would never appear in newspaper accounts of prevented attacks, a coordination center lay in ruins, its plans disrupted, and its personnel eliminated. The attacks that had been planned from that location would never be executed, saving thousands of lives through preventive action that most people would never know had been necessary. Morrison was waiting for her as she climbed down from her F-16, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone whose operational planning had achieved its objectives despite encountering resistance that had exceeded intelligence estimates. The insertion team formed up beside her aircraft, their faces still painted with camouflage, but their posture reflecting the confidence of professionals who had completed a dangerous mission successfully. "Welcome to your new life, Firehawk," Morrison said, his voice carrying implications that extended far beyond the immediate mission. "The world is safer because of what you accomplished tonight, and it will remain safer because of the missions you'll fly in the years ahead." She nodded, understanding that her transformation from conventional military pilot to shadow operations specialist was now complete. Her official identity was dead, replaced by a new existence that would be defined by missions that couldn't be acknowledged by the people whose lives were saved through preventive action that challenged threats before they could develop into full-scale conflicts. The debriefing that followed lasted until dawn, analyzing every aspect of the mission for intelligence that would improve future operations. The Coordination Center had been one of several facilities that were planning coordinated attacks, and its destruction would disrupt but not eliminate the threat posed by terrorist networks that operated across international boundaries, without regard for conventional military or diplomatic constraints. But for now, the immediate threat had been neutralized, and the personnel responsible for that success could take pride in professional accomplishment that transcended personal recognition. They existed in the shadow spaces between official military structures, accountable only to the missions they accepted and the outcomes they achieved through skill and determination that pushed human capabilities to their absolute limits. As the sun rose over the Pacific, painting the carrier deck in shades of gold and orange, Kaylin began her new life as a pilot who existed outside the normal structure of military hierarchies. Her F-16 was being prepared for the next mission. Her personnel file had been archived in databases that few people were authorized to access. And somewhere in North Carolina, her daughter was about to receive news that would reshape her understanding of service and sacrifice. The Prometheus continued its mission in waters that didn't appear on any official charts, carrying personnel whose identities were protected by classification levels that transcended normal security protocols. They were people who had chosen to exist in the shadow spaces where success was measured by conflicts that were prevented rather than battles that were won. Professionals whose work ensured that most people never needed to know how close they had come to experiencing warfare that could have reshaped international relations for decades. Her new life had begun with a successful mission that demonstrated the value of preventive action over reactive military operations. The coordination center was destroyed, its plans disrupted, and the attacks that had been planned from that location would never threaten the thousands of people who went about their daily lives unaware of how close they had come to experiencing terrorist violence that could have triggered regional conflicts spanning multiple continents. But this was just the beginning. Intelligence reports indicated that other coordination centers were continuing their planning, other threats were developing in different regions, and other missions would be necessary to maintain the delicate balance that prevented minor conflicts from escalating into major wars that could claim millions of lives. Morrison handed her a new set of orders that contained mission parameters for operations that would take her to different theaters of operation around the world. Her F-16 would be modified again, equipped with different systems designed to penetrate different defensive networks protecting different threats that required different approaches to neutralization. "Your next mission launches in 72 hours, he explained, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone that characterized people who planned operations that existed in the shadow spaces between official military structures. Intelligence indicates that a weapons shipment is being prepared for transfer to terrorist networks that could use them to attack civilian targets in 3 different countries simultaneously." The briefing materials showed a tactical situation that would require flying through airspace controlled by hostile forces, landing at a facility that was protected by defensive systems, designed specifically to eliminate aircraft that attempted to penetrate their perimeter, and extracting personnel who would be operating under fire from security forces, whose survival depended on preventing exactly the kind of mission she would be flying. It was exactly the kind of operation she had been training for her entire military career, the culmination of decades of preparation for missions that pushed pilot skill and aircraft capability to their absolute limits. Success would prevent attacks that could claim hundreds of lives while triggering military responses that could escalate into conflicts spanning multiple regions. Failure would probably result in her death, and the continuation of planning for attacks that would reshape international relations for decades. She accepted the orders with the calm professionalism that had defined her approach to every dangerous mission she had ever flown. The personal costs of her new existence were substantial. Emma would grow up believing her mother had died in the service of her country. Friends would remember her through the lens of official military service that represented only a fraction of her actual contributions to national security. But somewhere in the mountains of a country whose name would never appear in newspaper accounts of prevented attacks, a coordination center lay in ruins, because she had chosen to fly a mission that most pilots would have considered impossible. The attacks that had been planned from that location would never be executed, saving thousands of lives through preventive action that demonstrated the value of addressing threats before they could develop into full-scale conflicts. Her new F-16 was already being prepared for the next mission, equipped with modifications that represented technology decades ahead of standard military equipment. The aircraft would be faster, more maneuverable, and more capable than anything that appeared in official military budgets. but it would also be more demanding to fly and more dangerous to operate in the contested environments where her missions took place. As she walked across the carrier deck toward the briefing rooms where she would spend the next 3 days preparing for her next mission, Kaylin felt the satisfaction of someone who had found purpose that transcended personal recognition or career advancement. She existed in the shadow spaces where success was measured by conflicts that were prevented rather than battles that were won. And tonight she had proven that preventive action could save thousands of lives through missions that most people would never know had been necessary. The Prometheus continued its mission in waters that didn't exist on official charts, carrying personnel whose work ensured that the world remained safer than most people realized. They were professionals who had chosen to sacrifice normal lives for the opportunity to prevent conflicts through direct action, and their success was measured by the wars that never started because critical threats had been neutralized before they could develop into unstoppable forces. Her official life was over, replaced by an existence that would be defined by missions that couldn't be acknowledged by the people whose lives were saved through preventive operations that addressed threats in the shadow spaces between conventional military structures. But as she entered the briefing room where her next mission would be planned, Kaylin knew that she had found the purpose that had been guiding her throughout her military career. Some missions required pilots who understood that victory sometimes came at the cost of recognition, and that the most important operations were often the ones that never made the news. Tonight, she had become one of those pilots, and the world was safer because of the choice she had made to accept missions that existed beyond the reach of official acknowledgement or public recognition. The briefing room filled with personnel whose faces reflected the same combination of professionalism and dedication that had driven her own decision to join operations that couldn't be discussed in public forums. They were people who existed in the shadow spaces where success was measured by conflicts that were prevented rather than battles that were won. And tonight, they would begin planning her next mission in the endless war against threats that challenged international stability through violence that recognized no boundaries or limitations. Her new life had begun with success that demonstrated the value of preventive action over reactive military operations, and it would continue with missions that pushed human skill and technological capability to their absolute limits in service of purposes that most people would never need to understand. The coordination center was destroyed, the immediate threat neutralized, but other threats were developing in different locations, requiring different approaches to neutralization through missions that existed in the shadow spaces between official military structures. As the briefing began, Kaylin prepared for her next mission in an existence that had been transformed by her decision to accept operations that couldn't be acknowledged by conventional military hierarchies. She was now part of the force that prevented conflicts through direct action, ensuring that most people could continue their daily lives without needing to know how close they had come to experiencing warfare that could have reshaped their world in ways they never could have imagined. The war that never ended continued, fought by personnel whose identities were protected by classification levels that transcended normal security protocols. They existed to prevent conflicts through missions that pushed human capabilities to their limits. And tonight, they had proven once again that preventive action could save thousands of lives through operations that most people would never know had been necessary for their continued safety and security.